Last time we talked about tribalism, and we talked about how the fact that there are many different tribes within the Middle East. And one of the things that we need to come to terms with is that the way in which these tribes interacted with each other was on a number of different levels. Obviously, there was a fair amount of trade. If one particular tribe had access to certain resources, then they would trade those resources with other tribes and other tribal groups. This also happened in terms of people, where particularly the women of one tribe were often in a sense, bartered with another tribe. That tribe then gave some of their particular goods or whatever to the tribe who had now lost those women. And so in that way, the diversity was maintained within the different cultures and within the genetic gene pool as well. But what we see is that not all the interactions were of a commerce or a peaceful nature. In fact, the time that we're talking about in terms of the early part of the Tanakh are really a time of warfare. Now, this is a very important issue because often what people do is they use the Tanakh as an objectification of warfare. What they do is they say, well, the Bible says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, so therefore it's okay for us. Sometimes they may say, well, God told them to go out and wipe out everybody, so therefore it's okay for us to do it as well. But to do so, I believe, is to misunderstand the role that violence and warfare plays within the Old Testament and within the Tanakh. I think one of the big things that we have to do is to be very careful of two things. One is the fact that there was warfare within the Tanakh doesn't give us an excuse for warfare in our particular context. We need to understand that warfare and violence was endemic. It was part of the society. It was part of what was happening in the normal society within that area. Violence and warfare was normal. However, if we read carefully within the Tanakh, and particularly within Torah, within the law, we realize that it was never God's intent for violence to be that way. Which is, of course, why we get the law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Because what, in fact, the Tanakh was trying to do was to limit the level of violence that there was. Because, of course, what we realize by the cycle, or at least the spiral of violence, is that if one person hit somebody else, then that person would take a stick and hit them back. Of course, once they got hit with a stick, they would then take a knife and stab the other person. And so the violence would spiral. In an effort, I suppose, to stop that spiral of violence, what did they do? They put in that command, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So what it did was it said, if you take my eye, I can't take your life. And so what it did was it put a lid on the spiral of violence and made it only into a cycle of violence. You hit me, I can hit you back. But I can only hit you in the way that you have hit me. However, that was never meant to be the ideal. That was just meant to be the pressure valve that stopped the violence from getting out of control. If we read carefully in the Tanakh, if we read carefully in the Torah, what we realize is that there was a sense that forgiveness of the enemy, there was release of the enemy, there was do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All those systems were still there as well, but just often not put into practice. Warfare, violence was a means for negotiation. We need to understand that the second thing that we need to be careful of is transporting our ideal onto the Tanakh. We need to remind ourselves that what we're talking about is stuff that has happened 3,500 years ago. It was 3,500 years ago's worth of particular perspective. And as such, we can't judge them in terms of our morality now. But in the same way, true, we mustn't take their morality and say that somehow it is applicable for us now. In the same way that the Christian church came to understand that slavery should no longer be part of our environment. If you had told that to the Roman Empire, that slavery shouldn't be there, well, immediately you were going to get yourself into huge problems with the opposition to that process. But as we've moved on from that time, as we've moved on in the 2,000 years since the Roman Empire, what we need to realize is that we've come to an understanding that their morality, that the things that actually have typified their political framework in life, actually doesn't apply to us anymore. So we need to be very careful about putting our morality onto Tanakh or allowing their morality without any analysis to be connected to ours. Unfortunately, the Christian church didn't seem to listen to that. Because often the Christian church was typified by violence, was typified by warfare as much as anywhere else in the world. Even though Jesus himself had said, love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you. It realized that what we didn't do was learn. And in fact, the people who developed theories like just war used the Old Testament as justification for warfare into the New and the Christian era. But they did so only to justify something that they already wanted to do. Instead, what we need to do is to say, what is the role that warfare and violence plays within that environment? When we read Joshua and God tells them to go out and to go and kill every man, woman, child, dog, sheep, and everything else that is alive in those towns, what is it actually talking about? It's not giving us a license for warfare. And so if it's not giving us a license for warfare, what do we need to understand by it? How is that violence there connected to what we understand today? And that's really part of the process of interpretation. The last thing I want to share with you in terms of this, in terms of warfare, is that warfare often hinges on who's got the better weaponry. And a person called Christian Thompson developed what he called the eras of technological development. And the 3 eras that he developed was the Stone Age, through to the Bronze Age, and then through to the Iron Age. Now what we need to realize is that the Tanakh really travels through each of those particular stages. That at the beginning with Abraham and prior to Abraham we have the Stone Age. In the times of King David and King Solomon and the Philistines we have the Bronze Age. And then we have the Empire's Age, or the Age of the Empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, which are really in the time of the Iron Age. And so we can see that in fact the Tanakh spreads through the 3 technological ages. One of the things that allowed these empires to become so powerful was the fact that they had often made that technological leap into a new age. And it's that new age that is able to give them power and authority over the nations around them.